Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you today from Washington. And joining us now is Bob McChesney and John Nichols. They're the authors of a new book, The Death and Life of American Journalism. Thanks for joining us.
Our pleasure.
So Bob, you're a professor of communications. John, you write for The Nation from Washington, but you both co-founded Free Press. And you've been involved in this whole issue of the death of American journalism. Now you're making some proposals to give it a new life. Let's start with some assumptions, because we don't have too long, and I don't think they're tough assumptions, which is American journalism, in terms of its financial model, is broken. In terms of its substantive content model, is pretty broken too, especially when you look at the capitulation of most of the media around the Iraq War and since. Talk just a bit about the problem and then talk a little bit about the solutions. John, sure. Kick us off.
We'll outline the problem only because while you know it, and while frankly a lot of your viewers are well aware of it, because this is a very highly informed network, let's be honest, a lot of Americans still don't fully understand the scope of it. And it's not because they don't want to, it's because the media itself has done a pretty lousy job of looking at what really happened. There's sort of fantasies out there. One of them is that the internet came along and it made it really hard to do newspapers. In fact, newspapers were in steep decline well before the internet came into play. It also isn't the current economic turbulence that somehow made advertising revenues go down. These are not the real problems. The real problem is that really in the 1980s you saw a pattern of big companies starting to buy newspapers across the country. They also bought radio stations after the Telecom Act of '96. There's a lot of consolidation. But it was in the buying of these major newsrooms, the kind of core journalism outlets in communities across this country, for huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then as the advertising revenues continued to slowly go down, and then rather more steeply, they had a great deal of debt, very little of the kind of revenue that they assumed they were going to get. And they're like, well, how do we cut corners? How do we make this, how do we make our wild overspending come even? How do we keep our investors happy, give them 30% profits rather than the old 6-7% that newspapers used to operate on? Well, they started laying off journalists. And what's happened is that in the last 2 years, we have seen more than 1,000 newspaper employees a month in the United States lose their jobs. More than 1,000 a month. That is, more than 30,000 over the last 2 years. We've seen 140 daily newspapers just shut. Not little ones, big ones. Seattle, Denver, Albuquerque, Tucson, across this country. And we are seeing an incredibly rapid disappearance of journalism as we have known it. We know that the old media system wasn't doing all that good a job anyway, letting elections be stolen, letting wars happen that shouldn't have happened. But we're also losing that infrastructure that could have been better. And that's the really scary thing, because if it dies away, we're not going to be without news. We'll have news, but it will just be packaged information from very powerful people. A lot of PR, very little journalism.
If the demise of newspapers starts pre-internet and pre-big slowdown in ad revenue, it's a bit like what happened in the airlines industry, where you have a merger takeover mania, enormous debt to fund it, and then they have to pay the consequences of that. But does that suggest that it's not just a commercial model that's broken then? It's more this kind of neoliberal merger craziness?
No, it doesn't. I think that just accentuated the core problem, which was the commercial model. One of the illusions that Americans have had is that for the last 100 years is that the market would give us the satisfactory quantity of journalism we need, and then we could quibble over the quality. Maybe it wasn't that good, we needed higher professional standards. But I think now we can see that that was just a temporary period in which advertising emerged rather dramatically in the late 19th century to provide the basis for most of the revenues for journalism, news media, between 60 and 100% of revenues depending on the media. But without advertising, you wouldn't have had credible independent news media in the United States, or journalism. And now advertising is fleeing, it's jumping ship. Its relationship to journalism was always opportunistic. It had no great interest in journalism per se. It needed to support newspapers and broadcast news to accomplish its commercial ends. Now advertisers can go elsewhere. Oftentimes they no longer even associate with any content, let alone journalism, to accomplish their goals digitally, to sell their products. And we saw last year, for the first time in history, the New York Times received more income from non-advertising sources than advertising. 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable.
What would be examples of that?
The standard for newspapers for 100 years has been 65 to 85% revenues from advertising. So now they're under 50. And that's the direction everything's going. So now we're back to the situation that really existed in this country for the first 100 years, which is we have to face a situation where the market will not generate sufficient journalism. It simply isn't going to happen. The money isn't going to be there, no matter what we do. There will still be resources for journalism. There will still be some subscription money, but it's all going to be much less than we've ever been accustomed to. And that accounts for really the disintegration of journalism right before our eyes over the last 5 years, and the ongoing process where it's basically being eliminated as an enterprise.
Okay, so what do you say to people like Murdoch who say, I'm just fine, Jack?
Well,
Wall Street Journal, I believe I'm going to make money out of it. I'm making money out of Fox, and the problem is people don't want to buy what you're selling.
Murdoch's not just fine. One of the things about Rupert Murdoch is that he's done very well with a lot of bluster, but if you actually look at how well some of his projects are going, they're not doing journalism in any kind of realistic way. Fox's model, for example, wasn't to come into a market where there was insufficient journalism and put hundreds of reporters into the field to flood the world with a bunch of journalists, even coming from a conservative perspective. That would have been great. I would have been delighted. That's not what Fox does. Fox puts Sean Hannity on, puts Glenn Beck on. They don't have journalists associated with those shows. They go on and they have bookers. They book somebody to yell at somebody else.
I think on the broadcast side, that's pretty clear. What Murdoch would argue is on the newspaper side, Wall Street Journal, he's saying it's going to be a real newspaper. And maybe what we're looking at is 3 or 4 national newspapers. And does that model not work?
Murdoch makes a very big deal about the fact that they're doing well and they do have a decent circulation. But this is a publication that should have a natural audience. Right? Let's just say, who would the natural audience of the Wall Street Journal be? Millionaires? They should be the readers, right? Well, America has roughly 6 to 7 million millionaires. The Wall Street Journal doesn't have 6 to 7 million readers. They on their website says we've got 1 million people who pay to get some of our content. Well, that means they're reaching 1/7 of the crowd that they should. That sort of penetration in the old days of newspapering would be called a failure. What Murdoch is hoping is to be the last man standing. That's true. There's no doubt of that. He would love to buy the New York Times. He loves newspapers. I'd give him that.
Well,
but to be the last man standing, that's not sufficient journalism for a democracy.
And even if it is the last man standing, it will be the last man standing of a few newspapers for a section of the elite to read. So we're talking about most people.
That's right. The vast majority of Americans who aren't wealthy, who don't live in major metropolitan areas, what passes for journalism in this future we're entering very rapidly is non-journalism. It's scorched earth. And community after community in the United States today, there are hardly any journalists at all covering the community whatsoever, whatever their political views, whatever their orientation may well be. I mean, if you go into city after city, there's the newspaper, if it even exists any longer, is just a thin rag with hardly any original coverage. There's no radio journalism, there's no television journalism, there's no blogosphere out there covering City Hall. That's a fantasy. It simply doesn't exist. We have elections taking place in the United States now in community after community where no one who just lives in that community have any idea who's on the ballot. I mean, this makes the Soviet Union look like Athenian democracy.
Okay, well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about solutions. So please join us on the Real News Network.